Okay, so anyone has at the time to think about the Redfish schemes that they want to push for, talk about, standardize on?
So I have this document like on the GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that what we can do is maybe walk through it quickly and see like what people think is missing. So I can myself or the team can add more missing stuff. So maybe that will be helpful to trigger the discussion.
I think that makes sense. I think it's not just add, but maybe remove as well.
Yeah,
and we should be prepared for that.
Amend, yeah.
Yes, amend. That's a better way to put it. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. We can start with that. Just hope that some of the vendors did some thinking before the meeting. Yeah, at NVIDIA at least we took a look at a couple of schemes which we care about. Yeah, but let's start with the document. Why not?
Is someone okay? I was about to ask if someone was going to share.
If you want, feel free to share. I have no problem to take the share.
So you can pull it up. My only real concern is the very first curl command. If you can scroll to the right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're asking the BMC itself as the manager to reset. That should not be a required action. And that actually can break the connectivity to the BMC for, depending on the vendor and all, for how much time it takes to reboot. For example, I have some older BMCs in my house. They take 2 to 3 minutes to reboot.
Mm-hmm.
That's full system BMCs, but go ahead.
Absolutely agree with you, Julia. The reason that I put it here is just for the BMC update. When you update the BMC firmware itself, which is part of our day-to-day flow with DPUs, we need to update the DPU BMC as well, or AMC as we call it. So
yes,
when we do that firmware update, we absolutely need to have this command in order to new software to take place. So that's probably the only way why I put it here, because we're actually actively using that today.
Okay, then we should amend to note that specifically.
Absolutely, agreed.
Because most orchestration systems are only going to focus on the computer system object, not the manager object as well.
Don't disagree. I'm with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think it's as long as we add that context, then I think will be helpful.
Yeah, sure, no problem. As long as we add that note there, we have it in our firmware update as well. Regarding the reset type, it says false reset.
Just an example. Obviously, all resets are supported.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so false, graceful, all that.
Mm-hmm. I didn't want to go into too much details to actually explicitly list all the supported. We will do that. I just wanted to start kind of BFS. I wanted to kind of see high level all the buckets of commands that we want to support, and then we can deep dive on each and every and give more comments and lists, because I didn't want to lose the forest with all the trees. So
okay. It's actually one question. Do we want to start with the commands, or do we want to start with the schemes themselves?
The schema and the schemes are already defined. In this case,
yeah,
the commands kind of makes sense in terms of what objects and a minimally viable way to get there. Does that make sense?
In terms of what we want to, to enforce implementing, because the schemes are a lot. And we can dive into each one of them and say, this is a required part, this is not a required part. That's what I meant.
Again, I can give you my perspective is why I started this page. I started this page specifically for actions. For the reasoning is, why do we need the fields? and define the fields. Probably most common use for actually having the fields is for inventory purposes. When you think about orchestration system like Aronic, Maz, whatever you have out there in the industry, like they keep inventory of the cars, so they need basic information about the inventory, and then they need to perform action to do the life cycle. So that's the reasoning why I started with action. I'm not saying we will not end up discussing the fields themselves, but actions are probably easier lift to start with. So that's my reasoning why I started with specifically actions.
And the vendor could add other fields, like have stuff in OEM, and it may or may not matter. And they're entirely independent from you're trying to achieve a standardized action.
Some fields are really important. For example, serial numbers and stuff that we have to do, but yeah.
When I looked at
let's see all of this. So reboot device, my intention for reboot device is basically for the life cycle means updates, software firmware updates. We needed, after we do the actual update, we needed to reboot the device. The second thing is control boot order, right? So we know some cards can boot from network, either PXE, HTTP boot, whatever. So I wanted to have kind of an option through the Redfish to control the boot source of the device. So that is a command that I gave like an example here for PXE booting. Again, it didn't supposed to cover all the use cases, just an example. But again, my thinking is first, let's go through big buckets and see what we have to support before deep dive.
So there is, I've been bitten by this before, which is why it's stuck in my head. I think there's a second field you need to actually set on some implementations.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah, but it's like, do I do this continuously or do I do it as a one-shot operation?
You're absolutely right. And again, as I said, like it's not supposed to be a comprehensive list. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So once we define the boot order, the next section that I think we're thinking about is how we actually update the device. So when I updated the device, we basically today in Redfish, we have basically two methods. We have the simple update and we have the multi-part HTTP push. So I just wanted kind of to emphasize the two methods, and I wanted kind of show at least examples how to do that. And again, I'm missing some information here, but at least you understand the big bucket of sending the bundle or individual firmwares to be able to update those individual components.
Okay. Yeah, it's something that definitely makes sense to have.
So again, I do want to list all the different components here in the future, like how can we update the BMC itself, how we update the NIC portion of the DPU if it has one, how we upload maybe bootloaders separately, OS, right? So I listed here the list, like firmware update, OS update, software application update, NIC, BMC, or AMC update if it exists. So we do need to provide all the examples here. So this is just the start for this. Okay. So once we updated the device and something bad happened, usually we require some kind of recovery, right? So basically a reset to non-good state or factory reset, other different people call it by different names. So just one example how it's implemented today in the manager itself. I'm not saying this is, again, the only method, but in the manager, there is an action called reset to default. So you can reset to default the different persistent memory, non-volatile memory of the DPU.
I'm not sure that's going to apply to the OS running in the card because I'm not sure that such is modeled for a computer system. Just thinking out loud.
Yeah. So again, if you think about DPU as some kind of firmware as well running, so usually this firmware is going to have some kind of additional persistent memory like
Oh,
SPI flash or something like that. So yeah.
I completely agree. I think that the challenge before us is to model the reasonable expectation of such, because at some point you can't say I have 32 gigs of firmware and say I want to reset that factory defaults. You're reinstalling the device at that point.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is, most of the times that I've seen from my experience, updating or reprogramming the firmware is not touching the configuration. Configuration is usually a separate section in the SPI flash or whatever non-volatile memory. And when you upgrade, usually it's not being touched. So this specifically is talking about resetting the configuration to the last known good state, not specifically the golden image or the firmware itself, the configuration part of it.
But like, so either signaling to reset the section SPI flash that contains the configuration, or telling the firmware to reset NVRAM, basically.
Yeah. For example, I don't know, Redfish, you provision certificates, by reset to default, you end up with no certificates. Just something like that.
So probably another thing to do is just add a little more context to this one specifically.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, which use cases are relevant for to do factory reset of the DPU? I think it's case by case eventually, and kind of depends on the DPU vendor also as well.
Yeah, it's going to depend on how they approach the problem and where they store the config and what config you can in fact impact or not.
But it's good to.
I agree with you,
it's important to have
it's
important to have it either way, regardless of the use case. And I guess we can. We don't need to go into why do we need each command here or which use cases it would be used. Just the fact that we need it, and I think we can all agree that we need the ability to reset to factory.
And I also want to add is we are not going to deep dive with each vendor how exactly he implemented that and which non-volatile memory he forgot to reset versus not. That will be for customers to go. We will going to define there is such a command. You can reset the state. If the vendor fucked up and didn't do what it's supposed to do, it's a bug because there is a command. Customer used this command. They didn't do what it intended. So again, how much of the scope for vendor implementation, we'll leave it to the vendor to.
So we should, what I'm trying to say is we should set our expectation. We expect that if you run this command, that this configuration will be reset. This may not in fact impact all of the configuration that exists inside the DPU, but it should impact this configuration we expect to be reset, which may require additional actions to recover from.
I here, at least initially, took a very aggressive approach. I said, after this command, all non-volatile memory for configuration have to be reset to default. But I'm okay with compromises if you have a better way putting.
My point is, if you're running application software that on the card that is thinking it's running within a computer system as a normal application, so it has a config file, the manager reset endpoint is not going to reset that configuration file necessarily, but it might reset the ability to access the management controller.
Yeah.
So
I agree with you 100%. So clarification is indeed needed here. I was thinking about firmware registers, SPI flash for BMC, stuff like that, not the application and the configuration file on the operating root file system.
Then let's just notate that we're thinking these specific things that may be separate from what's running inside an operating system on the card.
Absolutely agree with you. That's a good one.
Think to yourself how this usually behaves as to factory defaults if the expectation is to actually think about the card as a new card from the factory, meaning everything is scratched, and this is a last resort operation, or is it just configuration on the being done so far?
I mean, it's going to depend by vendor. For example, some vendors might have endpoints that you can say, I want to reset this, but depending on the state of the machine, you might have to actually unrack, pull the cover, and reset jumpers. on physical on whole machines. I've had to do it in the last 5 years, so it's a thing.
Let's give a real example, since Gal, you are representing NVIDIA here. For example, Bluefield has BFB, but even if you push a new BFB, it is not touching MLX config registers, which are also persistent. So in my view here, reset to default should reset the MLX config, for example, as opposed to flashing a new BFB, which is not touching MLX config registers at all. So just
So
to give a more
we erase
example.
basically everything. We erase the NIC, the UEFI, the BMC, everything and reset to default.
Not necessarily. Maybe we can split it into two actions, because you can always send the new BFB or the new reboot update command, the simple update command, or HTTP multi-push, and that will reset your firmware itself, versus the reset to defaults, which is basically touching only configuration. This is my understanding how reset to default works, but we can open it and discuss and change our mind as we want. I'm not saying what I'm saying is golden, but this is my separation. If you want to update your software or firmware, like running versions, binaries, use simple update or multi-part HTTP push. If you want to reset the configurations, like erase certificates or MLX config reset, something like that, internal registers, for that you will use the reset to defaults probably. Because you can still run the same firmware version, but everything is resetted to the factory. It's open discussion. I don't have an answer, but that's my view.
Okay. So let's progress.
Okay. Another important thing is to synchronize times. So basically, we have two methods synchronizing time. We can run NTP service, but in Redfish, it's actually defined to use the patch method. You can patch the date time property of the Redfish, and this will actually set the date and time of the, for example, manager BMC AMC device here. So I wanted to emphasize this. There is a command to patch, and it will set the date and time of the device, which is extremely important to synchronize the clocks.
So is it mandatory, like changing the default password of the BMC? Setting the date and time. I mean, is it a mandatory operation before you're starting the session?
It depends on what you're doing and how you're using it. Like some software just won't care about the internal clock in the BMC. But if you want to log in and look at the logs in the BMC, then you want the time to be accurate.
You want time to be accurate in two ways. First of all is logs, as you said correctly, Julia, but second of all is all the secure boot stuff. We need to have an accurate clock to have the certificates valid. Because if certificates are invalid and you lost the clock for some reason, there is no battery on the card or something like that, you cannot even establish HTTPS sessions probably to the device, because the certificates will be rejected. So it's a good question.
Okay.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah, some browsers will reject it if a self-signed certificate if it's not within a reasonable date.
So I don't know whether we need to change initial password before we can set date and time. It's a good question. I would like to think about this more. Maybe somebody has a better answer. But
I think that changing the password is like mandatory, but maybe it's just our implementation and it's not like that in all the systems.
It's not.
Yeah, it's your implementation.
Okay.
There's plenty of hardware out there that will let you sit with default password forever. There's also some vendors are implementing basically mechanisms that force you to change the password eventually.
Okay, so let's move on. So last section that I added per all the comments is a secure.
I believe there's a law, at least in the state of California, that you can't, a well-known default password has to be changed on first use. So,
That's a new zero trust.
I mean, yeah, there's plenty of,
Mhm.
so first you can have a default password, but the first time you use it, you're required to change it. And I mean, that's only going to become more and more prevalent.
Do you happen to know the name of this law?
Oh, this came up the other day, but I'll have to go back and look it up. And
Yeah, I'm curious, at least living in California.
yeah, because I think it actually, yeah, it came up in a discussion about UEFI passwords, I think, but let me see if I can find it.
Okay. So secure boot is the last
Mhm.
section that I added, I think before the debugging of the device, per all the comments and discussions. Again, it doesn't have the full detailed implementation, just wanted to throw a couple of commands just to trigger this conversation together. So basically I put here, I think the reset keys action, I think.
Yeah, the
And
reset
secure boot
keys
enable.
and
Secure boot enable disable.
mhm.
We need to add more examples like how you add keys, actually, not just reset keys. So that's a work in progress. But basically, those are the high-level sections that I can kind of came up with. I wanted to bring two sections high-level for the discussion today, in addition to what we have here, in order to think, like, should we add those or those are irrelevant? One section is for user management.
Mhm.
Do we need to add users, remove users, list users, everything user management? Is it part of lifecycle or not?
I
Should
think
we
it very
state it?
much is the
And
user
next,
service.
yeah. So let's kind of what people think about the user management. If it is important, I'll add it today to this document again with just one or two examples how Redfish does it from user perspective.
Which schemas you're referring to when you're saying user management?
I just wanted to bring a very high-level thing, but basically Redfish allows you to create users, give users different roles and stuff like that. Different accesses. So I just wanted to bring this, whether it's...
I think Bacha is asking if basically you're asking about the account service schema of Redfish, and
Yes, sorry, I didn't catch that. Yes, account service, yeah.
yeah, and we talked about changing the default password of the DPU, so probably
So
also
that can
part.
fall into that category. Mhm. So
Not
what
sure if
people
it's
think
being done through
usually...
account service, actually.
Yes,
But,
it's part of the account
Part of the
service.
account service.
part of the
Changing the
account service?
password.
Yeah.
I have
Yes.
an examples, working examples, how to change the first password.
So, putting on my hat as someone that's been in systems lifecycle management for a very long time, you tend to ever think about additional counts. Some operators at large scales tend to tie the VMCs into centralized authentication anyway. It really just depends on case-by-case basis, and what people are doing in the security posture of their environment and their business. So I'm not sure how it adds value necessarily, or what problem it really solves.
What, to add accounts to the Redfish?
To extend user management to be part of a generalized thing, which may be entirely dependent upon their business processes or requirements. For example, my wife, all her job is investigate security incidents, create and delete accounts. And that's because of the way that her employer wants to run that business, even though it could be entirely automated and centralized. The insanity it varies, but regardless, that's how they have decided to run their business. And
Mhm.
I'm not really sure there's a value there. I guess what problem is trying to be solved? And
So
Boris, I hope that this at least provides a data point, because I'm kind of I've had
So I think the problem is being solved here is, first of all, again, you said that those redfish schemes are things that we want DPUs to support, not necessarily we force people to use them or describe when to use them. But for example, I can think of a situation where the data center management system would want to create a redfish user, which would have limited privileges, so it won't be able to do everything. So it would have a specific role, and with that role, do all the interactions with the DPU later on, whether it's actual manual, like human interactions, or whether it's the data system management itself should interact with the DPU, or components of it.
Yeah, I guess the question is, why would we need to as part of this? Is where my mind's wandering.
As a data management system, I would like to be able to create users with Redfish on the DPUs, let's say. So
But
if we define it as part of OPI, the data management system that wants to use those DPUs, we know that they have the ability to do so.
I mean, in years and years and years of working on Ironic, all of the requests that has ever come in as, can I reset the admin password? Or can I reset the password I'm using to talk to the BMC? We've never had anyone ask to reset to do user management inside the BMCs. Most people have separate systems that they've hooked them into. Or they restrict access so much that only 3 people in like 1,000-person company have access to the actual passwords.
So let's do like this, Julia and Gal. Let's put in account management as a section. At least we'll agree that initial password needs to be changed, and the initial password is through the account service. And then adding, removing users, we can defer it and discuss it furthermore next time. Is that acceptable compromise, Julia, Gal?
Oh, I think it's a great compromise.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm okay with it. I'm also okay with just pushing the accounts to when we have a use case and requirements for it. At the end of the day, that's also okay with me.
But at least changing initial password, we'll agree this is needed. So add the section
that's a
for account
must.
management, and then we'll give an example there. Okay. And the next section that I wanted to discuss is network configuration, right? Redfish allows us to have network interfaces, network devices, and to be able to perform a lot of operations, whether to define static or DHCP addresses, all that is network related. So I really been struggling with myself whether we need this as part of life cycle or not. So I don't have any good answer. So I want to.
Yes, we need it. We need it. If you want to maintain the XPUs, you need a way to define the Ethernet interface or the configuration. So basically, there are 2 relevant schemas: the Ethernet interface and network adapter, that you may want to use both.
So we'll agree, Bracha, right? So probably the most probable way for DPUs coming from the factory is with DHCP enabled on the management port, if they have one, right? So you plug in the
but
device.
you have a IPv4, IPv6, different OEMs use.
Yeah, but from the factory, probably all the DPU vendors are going to ship the standard configuration. The standard configuration is probably DHCP. You hook up it in your data center. You able to find your DPU in your data center. Now you can do a lot of operation. So for what reason you would need to change network configuration after you already be able to establish Redfish server with a BMC?
Just for example, if you have a DPU that has a problem and you want to connect to it via static IP, just there is some networking issue, you want to debug it or something, you should have a way to directly set up the network interface.
Just for the
Also,
management port or for the data ports?
I think that for both, also, I will just give another example. If you have multiple DPUs and you want to identify that the DPUs are related to some device with the serial number. So the way to do it is by collecting the information via Redfish and getting it.
But that's not network
Because
related,
in the
right? Because we can, that is not network related. We can go through the Redfish, can get a serial number of the DPU. We can go to the server and get the serial numbers of all the cards that are inserted in the server, and then we can correlate and match which DPUs belongs to which server. That is not network related question, no?
You can do it, I mean, easier if you have everything that everything is exposed via the schema, so you can get everything instead of ping pong with the server, the DPU, and the data center management.
You have to ping pong, no?
You kind of do have to, but could you elaborate on the use case or the challenge that you see, just so we can see if we're all on the same page? Because I'm wondering if we're not.
So I'm just I mean, trying to give you some motivation why we need to support these schemas. So I gave one example is IPv4, IPv6, a different, if you want to change the DPU network configuration. So even if it come out of the factory and you want to repurpose it or to reconfigure it in some way. So this is very important to have this capability via Redfish. Like we want the capability to change BIOS attributes, so we also want to change network configuration. I mean, everything is dynamic, even that the DPU is going out of the factory. It may have many changes when it is being connected to the data center.
You used the word "this" when you said that. What is the actual root feature that you're wanting? Because it sounds like you just want to be able to change all the configuration.
I'm not sure that all, but I'm giving. I mean, I think that network configuration, secure boot configuration, and BIOS configuration are critical. Because I mean, I don't find other schemas that are really critical other than this.
I don't disagree with you. I see a need to correlate some information, and humans will surely have to, and software will surely have to correlate some things and possibly identify and change things based upon different configuration. I think you're asking that the option exists to change the networking configuration via the BMC through the interface?
Yes.
So
I
basically,
mean, there are some
attributes
that are read only, but some attributes should be read write with the ability.
But basically, a second touch, what you're saying, right? So DPU shipped from a factory with DHCP enabled. You'll be able to onboard it to Ironic, for example, or bare metal as a service. Then you can start sending Redfish commands. You can now say, okay, I don't want DHCP, even if that was the initial configuration. I want to change from DHCP to static IP address. And that is what I want to support. And I want this to be IPv4 or IPv6, that kind of thing, right? So second touch.
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Does.
When you explain slowly, I understand quickly.
No, maybe I didn't explain it so well.
And you also gave a nice example of what happens if there is a network problem with the others being allocated by the DHCP server and just want the static others to debug.
But in that case, you cannot reach your Redfish to send the command to change the IP.
Depends
Yeah.
on the interface, but yeah. Depends on the interface.
You may have different Ethernet interfaces exposed. I mean, you have the Ethernet interface of the BMC, maybe of the manager, and the Ethernet interface of the DPU itself. So maybe one, I mean, maybe the DPU is not reachable, and then you just want to configure it, its address to static IP, but you still have Redfish connection to the BMC. So, I mean, it's really depend. You are right that it's not always feasible.
Okay. So I'll add a section for the network configuration. I'll start with something very simple for static versus DHCP, IPv4, IPv6. And I missed on this page, I also put the debug of the device. Gal, if you can scroll down, I want to discuss this. So basically, how we debug in the device, I just put two examples here for log service. How can we fetch logs from the DPU as well?
Yeah.
I didn't put anything like for additional like core dump collection and stuff like that, because I don't know if it's in scope, not in scope, how to even do it. But the log service is pretty standard in Redfish, and I think we do want to mandate all DPU vendors to actually support it.
No objections here.
I see Marvell here on the call. I see, HPE is another server vendor. Like, I want to hear from others. Like, we've been talking, Julia, NVIDIA, and myself quite a lot. Like, what other people think about this page or the direction we're taking? Are we off base, on base? Is it something that other vendors can support, cannot support? We don't want to be kind of developed with, yeah.
I think another interesting point would be networking configuration for the host level BMCs as well, because I'm not sure that's a standardized parameter for the manager, which might complicate if we're attempting to drive standardization there.
Network configuration for which BMC? I missed you there.
So I'm digging through the schema, trying to see where one would supply, say, I want the management controller to run DHCP, or I want to use this IP address on these specific networking parameters. I'm not seeing it in the DMTF's schema documents.
So there are two schemas, I think, network adapter and Ethernet interface.
For the interfaces themselves to provide the hardware, not for the manager. There is a parameter, but it just says a property, but it's just two different values with no additional information really. But it would be interesting to hear if those vendors also have interest or have capabilities. They might be OEM extensions for all we know. It's definitely something we probably need to look at further.
Okay, let me take a look and get back about it. Another schema that I think is missing here is about the certificate service. If we are supporting
I wanted to
Secure
put it
boot.
under secure boot. So I listed here all the risk keys. We can put here the certificates as well. So yeah, absolutely agree with you. Just didn't have time to put in examples. You can edit this page if you want to.
Okay.
Just to get back to what Boris mentioned before that regarding the other vendors, DPU vendors. At the end of the day, we are trying to create some standard about, what everyone needs to support. And we don't want to walk in a void. Yeah. Do you think we can get some, date commitments from you guys regarding if you approve what is currently listed in this document from your point of view? Not talking about contributing to it, just
Yeah, I think this is the right topic, and it is very important for the HPE as well.
Thanks, Toshi. From the DPU vendors, Gal, let's list. So NVIDIA, you're representing. Titan here represents Marvell. We know AMD Pensando doesn't have a Redfish at all. So, and they don't have a coprocessor. So they said, the VPN at least told us he can probably run it as a software on the ARM cores and expose those devices. So we need to get feedback from them. And I don't see anybody from Intel. We need to reach out to Ada and ask them. They have from what I know, without revealing too much details, they have a very advanced also Redfish schema implementation for their IPUs. So we just need to get details and commitment.
okay. Regarding Marvell list, that's the point that's missing. Okay, yeah, let's carry on.
Going back to certificates briefly, we're talking about the manager's certificate specifically for HTTPS API access, correct?
I wonder if the certificates can also be for the secure UEFI secure boot, not only for the manager.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, you
Okay,
have.
what about other BIOS settings? So
Hold
there
on,
is also BIOS schema to change the UEFI attributes.
Hold on. There is a manager HTTPS certificate, and then independently from that, there is a secure boot certificate. We need to cover both.
Correct.
And BIOS settings would be the BIOS setting attribute property. The problem there is going to be standardization of values or lack thereof.
Yeah, I'm really skeptical about BIOS setting certification because, again, in the server world, what we see in Dell, HP, Lenovo, we cannot agree on the standard. So in BIOS settings, there is a lot of OEM stuff going on. So we'll be very challenged to actually do anything in this world, in my personal opinion. But some things which are easy to do, for example, boot order and stuff, right? So we can definitely tackle those first before we try to generalize all of these arguments. But maybe I'm too skeptical. Maybe it will work.
I'm with your skepticism 100%.
Okay, maybe we should just refer to the common settings that everyone uses, like you said, like the boot order and
those settings are abstracted away so the BMC knows how to, or the management controller specifically knows how to translate that into either like an NVRAM update or into settings that will get asserted as soon as the machine powers back on. So it's going to vary based upon the actual design and implementation of the management controller and its interaction with the operating system.
okay.
Luckily, the need to change those are so common that they are abstracted away as requirements.
So I wanted to discuss also next steps. Like, okay, we came up with this initial list, and we can deep dive on each single command, enhance examples, enhance clarifications. Samer from ARM also volunteered to create a JSON schema for us as well, if we need to. I also want to kind of have maybe real examples with real DPU hardware, so we can take those commands, send them to Intel, Marvell, NVIDIA, and others, and show this is actually something that is actually working. So people that work on big orchestration systems can actually use them. Then maybe even try to integrate those commands into existing orchestration systems, if it's not done already. So I just want to kind of discuss how we take this to the next level.
So you mentioned a couple of things here. The first thing that you mentioned is the profile that Samar wanted to help us create, and another topic is the examples part that I guess we and others can need to check what we can provide and what we can't provide regarding it. And I think eventually each DPU vendor will need to circle back on it. So I can say that I'll check what we can provide regarding examples or not of the actions that are currently listed here. And regarding integrating them into existing data center management systems, then I guess our closest bet here is really OpenStack and Ironic, which has started to integrate this entity of a DPU into their system.
I think you guys have advantage. I'm joining these calls, so I can help proxy. We do have our community planning cycle mid-October, or so for a week we'll be doing meetings in that community, and if there are use cases or specific configuration aspects or things that are needed, then we could do like a joint session, or we could try and look at the requirement and try and provide feedback and try and see what we can do, or maybe not do, depending on what's going on, just to try and find what makes sense, I guess, if that makes sense. So if someone's got a solid use case that like to get hammered out, then I think that would be useful with expensive time to hammer through it and figure out what we can do.
So that's from Ironic perspective. I do, Gal, also want to pull in Canonical, because BIMAS is doing a lot of work in the DPU space right now. So I think they can really help us drive exactly what they need versus what they already implemented and released in their BIMAS, in order to help us shape what absolutely must requirement commands we must have across DPU vendors versus specific ones. So let's try to reach out to Canonical. They were part of these calls initially, so I'll try to find the contacts and we can bring them to one of the sessions to discuss this openly.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Okay, that's a good next step. So regarding the profile that we wanted to create, do you want to derive it? Do you think we should derive it from the actions we want to support, or should we derive it from the properties? At least start with the properties we know that we will need to use eventually in Detect.
We need to understand why we're creating these profiles, right? So the profiles is for us to take any new or existing DPU vendor and verify that what we defined is actually supported and implemented, and have a V or X. Is it working or doesn't work? That's, I think, why we need to create those profiles.
The folks in DMTF highly prefer that consumers of Redfish do implement profiles so that they can help communicate through requirements and also ensure that they don't accidentally break with schema changes.
Okay. So we understand the need. Now, how do you want to go about it? Do you want to start with, because we know that, as you mentioned at the beginning, that things like serial number and model maybe that we know we need to report, right? We can go over, I'm just opening his example. We can go over existing profiles, see what schemas and fields we want to standardize on, we think are important for us, and start some initial profile in our repo, and extend it as we go along and add more actions.
So Gal, just so you know it, right? We cover this in the inventory folder. We have a lot of information on the property that is needed for inventory. We even implemented SMBIOS to gRPC service to report inventory through gRPC. So there's a lot of work that already been done in the inventory space that we want to kind of also do in Redfish space, or like maybe at least reference some of the work that we already did. So I just want to understand what is the thinking here exactly.
I think what you suggested is actually a very good way to start this thing. We can take a look at what it currently did on the inventory, see what we can and how it is reported through Redfish, and just convert it to the field scheme of Redfish. So we'll be aligned.
Point of clarification, the standard, unless it's an OEM field, the standard basically defines what's going to be there in the responsive bodies. The purpose of the verification schema is to try and drive that awareness in both directions of what's used by the consumer or implementation. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think we're done for the day. I'll write up the summary, including the next steps that we mentioned. And yeah, let's meet up next week. I guess we'll circle back to the boot stuff, and afterwards we'll go back to this Redfish part.
Okay, awesome.
A great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thanks. Bye.